Welcome to the Weekly Roar, coming live from the Lion's Den, helping new managers become great leaders and awesome bosses. And now, here's your host, Greg Storch.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me today. Welcome to the Weekly Roar. I'm Greg Storch, owner of Lion Enterprise, host of the Weekly Roar, and the founder of a worldwide bartered coaching program called The Helping Hand. Now, I'm a certified professional leadership coach and a certified leadership speaker and trainer. Today, I'm sharing tip number 3 for new leaders. This is an interesting topic today because there are a lot of leaders who shy away from this tip because they believe it can be perceived as a sign of weakness. So let's get started with tip number 3, and that is be aware of your emotions. When it comes to leadership, our success is determined by our ability to form and cultivate relationships with others. Good leaders are connectors, but it takes someone who is in touch with their emotions to develop relationships that count. Now, in the business world, emotions aren't typically something we hand out accolades for having. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's even frowned upon to show emotion and develop relationships in our positions as leaders. But I'm here to tell you that that thought is old school. And if you want to be a relevant leader in today's day and age, you have to get in touch with your emotions. And emotional intelligence is having the ability to not only recognize and manage our own emotions, but the emotions of other people as well. But that's really a new approach, isn't it? Leaders typically lead from their thoughts, their brains, their thinkers. They lead from the head space, but it's when a leader can tap into their heart space that they can really begin to make a significant change in the way they lead others and themselves. Now, there are typically 5 main areas that are associated with EQ, or emotional quotient. They include self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. Now, if you look at each one of those things, those aren't small topics. So I'm going to just do a little dive down deeper into each of these areas, and then I'm going to share a tip with you on how you can improve it. Okay? So let's start out with our own self-awareness. Now, self-aware leaders know how they feel. They can recognize how their emotions affect those around them. They can acknowledge and identify the emotions they're experiencing in any given situation. Now, typically what happens, though, is that a leader may experience an emotion, let's say disappointment or even anger, and instead of acknowledging the feeling, their actions take over, and then they end up yelling or getting mad. Now, when I work with my coaching clients, one of the things I try to identify is where they're coming from right away. Are they in their head space or their heart space? See, when we get stuck in our head space, we're just that. We're stuck. It isn't until you can shift your perspective and come from the heart space that you can be in a position to make any changes. Now, I usually hear words like, I think, instead of, well, I feel like. And by the way, self-awareness isn't just restricted to emotions. Self-awareness lets you acknowledge the role your ego plays in your leadership. And you also have the ability to acknowledge not only the things you're really good at, but also the things that you aren't so good at either. So if you're a thinker and not so much a feeler, then here's a quick tip on how you can improve your self-awareness as a leader. Pause, slow down. Don't react to situations immediately. Take time to process and engage in critical thinking, which means challenging your own assumptions as well as those of others. Make sure that your reaction is measured and appropriate, not flawed by an emotional outburst in the heat of the moment that you don't acknowledge. A simple question of, how does that make me feel, is a great place to start here. If we know a situation has made us angry, irritated, pissed off, having self-awareness will allow us to take that step back and check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. So practice the pause until you can come from a better place and a clearer head to make a decision or take an action that will be in the best interest of everyone involved. Now, the second thing I mentioned earlier is self-regulation. So let's talk about that. I speak about this all the time, but everything begins with us, especially in leadership. And that's why self-regulation is so important. Basically, you're the boss of you. When it comes to regulating yourself, you need to be firm and fair. You stay in control of your emotions instead of lashing out from them. And maybe more importantly, we hold ourselves accountable for those actions. Remember, people do what people see. When they see that their leader is calm, that gives them reassurance and they remain calm as well, right? So if you're more known to get overexcited about things and sometimes let your emotions run away from you, then here's a tip that I try to use. Now, notice that I said try to use. And that tip is to remain calm, or better yet, return to calm before moving on. See, I'm human just like you are, and I'm not perfect at this. So that's why I continue to try to get better at this. But once you have self-awareness, you can really start to better self-regulate. And one of the best ways to do that is to remain calm. Maybe employ a centering exercise or a breathing technique. Now, believe it or not, the third characteristic of emotional intelligence has to do with our motivation. Now, our motivation comes in some part from our ability to understand what we want to do and why we want to do it. Now, I don't think there's anyone here right now that hasn't heard of Simon Sinek and his big push to find your why. He's a huge proponent of EQ. Knowing your why will require a bit of self-reflection, but you'll see that motivated leaders have high work standards for themselves. They're intentional and consistent in how they achieve those goals. Now, leaders with high EQ not only motivate themselves, but by being able to understand what makes their followers tick, they can motivate them to find their own whats and whys. Now, if you haven't found your why or you struggle with the motivation part, then my tip here is to learn how to value optimism more. See, being optimistic is good for us. It improves our emotional well-being and it helps us cultivate better relationships. And it can be even helpful to protect us against bad things that happen. Think of optimism as a helpful response to stress. Now, I'm not talking about turning into a pom-pom waving cheerleader, woohoo, or just thinking happy thoughts all the time. I mean using it to help to see the benefits of a situation and then using that optimism to sustain your commitment to succeed. Now, at the end of the day, it helps us to expect the best in the future. And so we work to achieve that. Done correctly, and you may actually see the future as something that you can actually control. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't include empathy as one of the 5 ingredients to emotional intelligence. I've spoken about the value of empathy in leadership before. Simply put, a leader who has empathy can put themselves in other people's shoes. In other words, they have the ability to change their perspectives and view things from a vantage point other than their own. And that's powerful. Empathy is a leader's superpower. It's like a superhero leader, able to develop people around them, challenging stereotypes and leaping over false assumptions. But empathy is a great tool that allows us to connect with others and That's a key thing in relationships. When we use empathy in our leadership, we become someone who can provide thoughtful and unbiased feedback. We can be a great listener, an active listener, and it helps our teams to navigate challenging situations. Now, one of the things that I do to improve my ability to be more empathetic is to use a coaching skill called acknowledging and validating. Now, that's when you identify an emotion and then validate that for the client. A good acknowledgement and validation can be the one thing needed to break down that thing that stands in their way of moving forward. But it requires that we actively listen for and can identify the feelings of others. Sometimes one of the best ways to do it is through nonverbal cues. You know how it goes with body language. Sometimes how we say something is just important as what we've said. With empathy, we're able to observe those long pauses after we deliver bad news, or that deep sigh an employee tried to hide, or the employee who just looks plain old worn out. Those things matter. The empathetic leader will pick up on these nonverbal cues and be able to respond to them by addressing the emotions behind them. Now, the last characteristic of emotional intelligence is soft skills. And let me tell you, there's nothing soft about them. They're hard. But you probably know a leader that you might describe as being that proverbial people person or who has great social skills. Well, social skills are about the art of making an emotional connection with communication. Leaders with good social skills are able to deliver bad news and celebrate good news in a way that makes people feel the same way about both of them. Leaders with high communication skills are also talented at resolving conflicts and managing change. And that's something people can get behind. When people's lives will be affected by a decision, leaders with high emotional intelligence will demonstrate they respect the needs, the fears, and the hopes of the people that are involved in that decision. So my last tip to improve your social skills as a leader is to resolve conflict with care and communication. You can avoid a toxic environment in the workplace by placing a focus on conflict leadership and not just conflict management. Talk of emotional intelligence, or EQ, has actually been around for years, but some leaders still think that it's touchy-feely nonsense. The problem with this train of thought is that nothing could be further from the truth. And so that's why this is another tip that I share with new leaders. I want them to understand that it's not just okay to tap into our emotions as leaders, but it's essential to good leadership. Being in tune with your emotions is not a sign of weakness. So don't let anyone make you feel less than because you are developing your EQ as a leader. I found this quote the other day that said, if you are tuned out of your own emotions, you will be poor at reading them in other people. And with that said, that's going to do it with today's Weekly Roar tip number 3. Get in touch with your emotions. Now, don't forget to join me next week for tip number 4 as we continue this countdown to episode number 200, which is scheduled to hit in late April. Until we meet again, remember, be powerful, but stay poised, just like a lion. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for watching the Weekly Roar live event at lionenterprise.com. If you enjoyed this video, please tell others to join us each week here in the Lion's Den. Thanks again, and see you next week.